It was once a region that enjoyed open borders and lucrative cooperation with its westernized neighbor. Apart from the Russian mainland and nestled between Poland and Lithuania, Kaliningrad was, if not thriving, then at very least surviving. Now it's becoming a rotting husk of useless land. Separated from Russia and cut off from the West, Kaliningrad is dying. Socially and economically, the exclave is now a powder keg that is gearing up to explode in Putin's face as Russia's president is losing control. That's according to The Russian Dude, who is a YouTuber who can ask and then answer many of the questions people have about what life is really like in regions like Kaliningrad, where security is tight and from which so very little information escapes. But one thing we know for certain is that life was once very different for the people of Russia's little exclave. For decades, Kaliningrad played the strange role of being Russia's most European region, The Russian Dude says. You could hop across the border, go shopping, work, study, trade, travel. People spoke foreign languages, had European friends, drank European beer, and lived in this surreal bubble that felt detached from the harsh Moscow-centric reality. Indeed, Kaliningrad had long been considered the most European of Russia's territory before Vladimir Putin launched his ill-fated invasion of Ukraine. Back in 2020, Peripheral Histories even wrote that the exclave was becoming European as much as it was Russian. The complexities that emerged in a post-Soviet world had somehow led to Kaliningrad becoming a strange outlier whose local identity sometimes diverged from Moscow-centric narratives. A de-Russification of sorts was happening, much like the one seen in many of the other former Soviet states. Only Kaliningrad is still part of Russia. A cultural shift was also happening in Kaliningrad just a few years before the start of the Ukraine war. Many in the exclave actively defied Russian strong-arm tactics to start extolling the virtues of what we're now seeing as the westernized German intellectual figures that came from the exclave's Albertina University. This slow westernization, or perhaps more accurately, individualistic approach to culture, was also seeping into Kaliningrad's politics, architecture, urban planning, and lawmaking. The Russian grip was slipping. And to some, it seemed that Russia was willing to allow Kaliningrad its little European excursions, with only token efforts being made to crack down. The situation was such that organizations like the International Center for Defense and Security, or ICDS, were making claims that Kaliningrad, which is also known as Königsberg in some parts of Europe, should become part of the European Union, or EU, when Russia's forces eventually leave. There was even a discussion of Russia pulling its soldiers out of the exclave as recently as the center's 2018 article. That same article also saw ICDS claim that Russia may not have as much legal claim to Kaliningrad as it believed. Its rule was de facto, not de jure, and there were no real treaties in place that saw the West agree to the annexation of the region under the Soviet Union, and seemingly nothing that has come since. Some in Kaliningrad itself would likely make this argument as they fight for independence, but that's a topic for later in the video. The point we're making is that Kaliningrad, before Putin's war, if not European, was Europe adjacent, Europe friendly. Basically a strange antithesis of the values that Putin and his cronies wanted to impart within Russia, even at a time when Russia and the West were at relative peace. Then Putin launched the Ukraine invasion, and everything changed. But now imagine this, The Russian Dude says. One day the war begins, sanctions roll in like a tidal wave, and suddenly you discover that your entire region depends on the goodwill of countries that your government is actively threatening. That goodwill was massive for Kaliningrad. The likes of Poland and Lithuania, both of which border the exclave, saw the writing on the Russian wall and responded. The former restricted transit as the latter tightened its border controls, and the people of Kaliningrad, who had once enjoyed the ability to import, to travel freely, and to benefit economically through ties to the West, saw their lives change irreversibly. A war happening hundreds of miles away had changed their lives, doing enormous amounts of damage in the process. That change came in a number of ways, and all led to a wellspring of discontent forming in an exclave over which Putin needs to maintain his hold. Kaliningrad is now transformed from a Europe-friendly exclave into a hellhole for the people who still live there. Now Kaliningrad is sealed off, strangled by sanctions, drowning in shortages, and treated by the Kremlin as if it's some rebellious child plotting an escape, The Russian Dude says. Economically, the many restrictions placed on Kaliningrad have hit its people hard. Though, as The Guardian pointed out in June 2022, Kaliningrad has always been reliant on Russia for many of its goods. It received much of its food through trade with EU states. That trade has collapsed in on itself. The supplies from Russia aren't exactly flowing either. Kaliningrad relied on the Russian mainland to send it tons of coal, coke, and oil, all of which had to pass through Lithuania by rail to arrive. Lithuania feels threatened by Russia's actions in Ukraine. Naturally, it isn't allowing Kaliningrad to go unscathed. We saw that in October 2025 when Lithuanian Railways made the huge decision to prevent Lukoil from transporting its oil products by rail to Kaliningrad via Lithuania. That move was made as a response to US sanctions against Lukoil and another of Russia's energy giants, Rosneft. That was a body blow for Kaliningrad that followed up on the repeated economic shots to the head that it's taken since Putin invaded Ukraine. As LRT points out, Lithuanian Rail had transported 371,000 tons of oil products into Kaliningrad in 2024, of which 345,000 tons came from Lukoil. In 2025, and before the US put its new sanctions in place, the same rail company had helped ship 194,000 tons of Lukoil products into the exclave. Then just like that, the oil was gone. This is just one example of how sanctions have hit Kaliningrad harder than perhaps any other Russian territory. The problem with being cut off from Russia is that the motherland has to work much harder to keep you supplied. Putin being Putin, any decision that amounts to a choice between helping Kaliningrad and helping either Russia's military or the more important regions of Russia inevitably goes against the exclave. And it's not like Lithuania was taking a laissez-faire approach to shipments heading into Kaliningrad during the early months of Putin's war. As one concrete business owner named Igor Pleshkov told the BBC back in June 2022, "We produce commercial concrete, iron concrete and paving stones. We first experienced a shortage of cement back in March, after Europe imposed sanctions on Russian banks," Pleshkov told the outlet, adding, "Trains with cement were being turned back at the Lithuanian border because the rolling stock was owned by leasing companies who were under sanctions." His company hadn't produced a single cubic meter of concrete between the start of Putin's war and June. Not exactly good for a concrete business. These sanctions-related problems had been affecting Kaliningrad's regional economy long before the Lithuanian Railways decision. Back in January 2024, the Jamestown Foundation wrote about how the exclave's economy was buckling under the weight of Western sanctions. Between 2022 and 2023, the foundation says local sources have reported cumulative losses of $67 million endured by the international freighters working in Kaliningrad due to sanctions. That may not seem like much, but it's not like Kaliningrad's gross domestic product, or GDP, was all that impressive. In 2020, Harvard University's Metroverse estimated that the exclave had a GDP per capita of $20,800 for a population of about 324,200 people. That gave Kaliningrad a regional GDP of a little over $6.74 billion, with its GDP per capita also placing it 268th among the 290 European cities that Metroverse examined. Good enough to survive, but far from an infallible economy that can absorb things like losing out on tens of millions of dollars in about a year without any sort of effect. Local officials had gotten desperate enough by the time of the Jamestown Foundation's article that they were proposing an investment into a new tourism project that developers estimated would cost $4.4 billion, or about 2/3 of Kaliningrad's GDP. This for an exclave where the average tourist stays for 3 days and only spends $46 per night. These are the sorts of desperate proposals that come out of a region that knows that it's going through the economic ringer. Fast forward to December 2025, and the Odessa Journal was reporting that Kaliningrad was entering 2026 facing a number of economic setbacks that would soon become apparent. A deficit is now projected. Kaliningrad's revenue is anticipated to reach a little over $1.9 billion at a time when expenditures amount to almost $2.15 billion. A proposed $66.7 million investment from the mainland into Kaliningrad's maritime infrastructure might help a little, but it's like trying to kiss a bitter wound that's spurting blood. A little bit of kindness from a Kremlin that doesn't really care isn't going to heal these kinds of economic issues. This minuscule investment won't do much to help Kaliningrad's economy in the future. Transit costs are rising, which isn't helped by Lithuania cracking down. It's tough for companies and people in Kaliningrad to get their hands on fuel, construction materials, and critical goods, especially those that were imported in the past. This is the weight of sanctions, designed to hurt Russia, crushing its little exclave under their weight. And as you'll discover soon, Kaliningrad's people are starting to ask a lot of questions. Speaking about transit costs, the New Voice of Ukraine published some figures, courtesy of Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service. The outlet noted that Kaliningrad was being forced to rely on its maritime routes to the point where shipments had risen from 0.4 million tons in 2019 to over 2 million tons in 2024. But far from being an example of Russia overcoming the transit problem, this represents an overloading of the Kaliningrad systems that isn't being made any better by the few companies in Kaliningrad that still make money reserving the prime ferry spots. Small businesses are out of luck, as Kaliningrad's logistical problems are bringing many close to collapse. The exclave has essentially become a puppet in Putin's war game, a territory onto which Russia's president clings while trying to do the bare minimum to make Kaliningrad a place where people have any chance of living well. For an exclave that had made being a partner with several European countries, Lithuania perhaps being the most important, the West's constantly rising raft of sanctions has been devastating. That's why the sanctions hit Kaliningrad so brutally, the Russian dude explains when talking about the loss of these partnerships, because the region wasn't designed to live in isolation. It had no reason to, it never wanted to, but it does, and it's all Putin's fault. What the Russian president has forced the people of Kaliningrad to do is unwillingly reject the partners that were far more important to their survival than the Kremlin had been for years before the start of the war. Enemies were made out of former friends, as the Russian dude adds. Before the war, ask any Kaliningrad resident who their neighbors were, and they would tell you, friends. Poles crossed the border to shop in Kaliningrad because prices were lower. Russians crossed the border the other way because the quality was higher. Cooperation was at the forefront of life in the exclave, and it was all squashed by Putin's war. The Russian dude isn't just making all of this up to present an anti-Kremlin narrative either. Beyond the trade, there was plenty of evidence that Kaliningrad's new enemies are far from the foes that it ever wanted. As The Guardian reported in 2018, Putin's campaign to demonize the West in the eyes of all Russians hadn't exactly worked in Kaliningrad. The outlet spoke to one resident named Alexander who said, "I travel to Poland a lot and see how people relate to Russians. Everything is fine, there are no problems. The Poles are people just like us." Alexander even went on to call out the Kremlin rhetoric of the time as lies. One has to wonder what he feels about these lies now that the rhetoric has been ramped up so substantially. Other evidence furthers this point that Kaliningrad's people see Europeans as friends. New Eastern Europe said in July 2019 that Kaliningrad had partnered with the Polish city of Gdansk, and that partnership was apparently so important that the exclave had made it possible to enter using a free electronic visa. Returning to The Guardian's 2018 piece, it pointed out that more than 70% of Kaliningrad's residents had passports compared to the Russian national average of less than 30%. As much as Putin might want to argue that his people should hate the West, Kaliningrad was once proof that they didn't. Perhaps they still don't. It's not easy to force people to cast off those they consider friends, and there is plenty of evidence that many people in Kaliningrad don't want to be part of Russia's system anymore. As we said earlier in the video, discontent is rising, though it's hard to gauge by how much, given how hard Russia tries to crack down on any seeds of dissent. Still, as in so many cases with Kaliningrad, the evidence escapes in spurts. Again, some of the hints come from before the Ukraine invasion, back when information flowed a little more freely out of Kaliningrad. In August 2014, which is the year you may remember as the one in which Putin annexed Crimea, The Guardian reported that there were some in Kaliningrad who were slowly forming into an independence movement. That movement didn't have the legs it needed, at least not a decade ago, but there was clearly a wellspring of discontent in an exclave in which The Guardian claimed many youngsters were already starting to struggle to name some major Russian cities. One Moscow commentator named Vladimir Titov claimed that the elders of the region often spoke about conditions in Russia as though the motherland were a foreign country. Titov added that some in the exclave had even taken to calling the exclave the Amber Country, so chosen because amber is one of Kaliningrad's most plentiful resources. As for youngsters not knowing the names of Russian cities, Titov said, "This isn't surprising. Warsaw and Yarmala for these young people are closer and more familiar than Kaluga or Khabarovsk." If this is evidence of the increasing detachment from Russia that many in Kaliningrad feel, a referendum held in February 2023 shows that even with Russia's suppression of Western sentiment, there are many in Kaliningrad who now call for a complete separation from Moscow. Ukraine's Center for Countering Disinformation reported on the referendum, which took place entirely online and included 5 Russian regions. In Kaliningrad, 72.1% of those who voted said they wanted independence versus 27.9% who voted against. The small caveat to this vote, as noted by the Human Security Center, is that only 95,567 of Kaliningrad's population took part. However, that still amounts to 19.4% of the exclave's population, which could be considered an adequate sample size to suggest that enough people in Kaliningrad want to be out of Putin's clutches. 72.1% of the 95,567 want it so badly that they were even ready to risk being targeted for their vote, even if that vote was cast in an online referendum that should theoretically grant them anonymity. You can never be quite sure of that in Russia. Yet still, thousands cast their vote. And why wouldn't they? As the Russian dude points out, many in Kaliningrad see no reason to stay aligned with Russia. Even those who are not asking for the exclave's independence are still asking questions, the YouTuber says. They're asking why their peaceful coexistence with Europe was sacrificed for a war waged thousands of kilometers away. A war that gave them no benefits, no victories, no opportunities, only shortages, scrutiny, and suspicion. Those mentions of scrutiny and suspicion are important, as they hint at the Kremlin's panicked response to the prospect of losing Kaliningrad to the will of the exclave's people. Of course, Putin isn't responding in any meaningful or compassionate way to make the lives of people in Kaliningrad better. That takes effort and requires the building of trust. Instead, he's trying to crack down on anything that resembles anti-Russia sentiment emanating from the exclave. We saw some glimmers of this crackdown come into play in October 2025. That's when Mediazona reported that Russia had cracked down on supporters of the Anti-Corruption Foundation, which was founded by Putin's opponent Alexei Navalny. All told, there have been 114 criminal cases launched against Russian people for making donations to the foundation. Of those cases, 6 involved people from the Kaliningrad region. That was the 4th highest number of any location on the list, which is impressive given the exclave's small population. Russia has also launched a campaign against what the Jamestown Foundation sarcastically calls the non-existent global movement of anti-Russian separatists. Neither journalists nor analysts can even verify the existence of the group, and yet the foundation claims that Russia is bringing cases against dozens of people who have supposed ties. The foundation name-checks Kaliningrad as one of the locations where people have faced Putin's phony brand of justice. But Putin's problem is simple: the crackdown won't work. Russia neglected the people of Kaliningrad for too long in favor of treating the territory as little more than a strategic asset. Putin's short-sightedness allowed those people to westernize, to form the European friendships that have so cruelly been snatched away from them. And now that Russia is cracking down, what Putin thinks is the solution to the Kaliningrad problem is going to end up being the one thing that pushes the exclave further out of his reach. This paranoia created a fortress mentality, the Russian dude says of Russian suppression techniques, up to and including labeling even the most mildest of criticism against the Kremlin as extremism. More checkpoints, more military drills, more rumors about NATO attacks. The irony? People in Kaliningrad never feared NATO. They feared the Kremlin ignoring them again. Ignorance is bliss in Putin's mind, and he seems intent on pretending that the Kaliningrad problem won't exist as long as he cracks down hard enough. But it does. It has for decades. And now, all it might take is for the Kremlin to overstep in a region where anti-Putin sentiment is higher than most other Russian territories for Russia to lose its grip on Kaliningrad for good. It's not like Russia itself is immune from Putin's combination of arrogance and ignorance. The rest of Russia is struggling too, and that's another massive problem for its aging president. As hundreds of thousands of Russians die on the battlefield, Russia's economy is collapsing, and Putin's geopolitical influence is on the wane. Putin tried to do something so insane that he broke Russia forever, and you can find out what he did if you check out our video. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to The Military Show for more analysis of what Putin doesn't want you to know. And thank you as always for watching.